Stockmark is developing Japanese language LLMs that specialize in business applications, market analysis, sentiment detection, and predictive analytics, among other things. Obviously, there's a huge market for financial firms, hedge funds to be able to crunch a ton of data with AI. Phil, I know you have a ton of thoughts there.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like DeepSeek themselves, they're a hedge fund, and when they created DeepSeek originally, the R1 model, that was so that they could get an edge in the market. And so it makes sense that you have financial institutions that are creating their own unique LLMs designed specifically to like hyper analyze information and sentiment across the entire open internet. So Stockmark is primarily focused on Japan, which makes sense because I think even if I throw Japanese into OpenAI, it's not 100% accurate. And it probably misses those cultural like undertones. So it'll be interesting to see if things like these walled gardens for financial institution models pays dividends down the road.
With Stockmark, I think it's a lot of what we also covered with Sakana AI. They're really focused on training toward the Japanese market. So a statistics I've seen from AWS is that only 0.1% of training data is actually Japanese. So this is sort of the training data that other large-scale language models are training on. So what Stockmark actually has done is gathered approximately 220 billion tokens from domestic market data and technical management data to really train specifically on the Japanese market. So this is something that big Japanese players like Panasonic, Nippon Steel are really leveraging for them to utilize AI more efficiently within the Japanese market itself. So again, OpenAI, great in the US market, great in the English-speaking world. DeepSeek and the other five tigers, great in Chinese, probably pretty good in English as well. But again, for this very specific use case in Japan, a whole different data set. And it seems like places like Stockmark are going deep on training within Japanese data.
I just looked up Stockmark on Hugging Face, and they've released 3 of their papers. Their most recent one is called Plamo, I think, Plamo. 100 billion parameter model, and they use 2 trillion tokens. So even the Amazon press release where they're talking about using 200 billion tokens to train their models, their newest white paper is 2 trillion tokens. That's insane to me. Which makes sense. Like, if OpenAI only has 0.1% dedicated to Japan, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that they're gonna build their own highly specialized Japanese language model. 2 trillion tokens is an insane amount. Like, that is an insane amount of data to be feeding through it. They also used a lot of supervised training and fine tuning, which is very, very expensive to do. And so it seems like this is a serious effort to create a model for the Japanese community. Like, definitely huge leap forward in as far as like creating a LLM that is hyper focused on Japanese language and culture.
I mean, even if Japan is a smaller market than the US and China, obviously, I think for startups that can really get ownership of that market in Japan and build sort of fiefdoms within the Japanese market, there's huge opportunity for growth there. I think OpenAI might be making the assumption that, hey, 0.1% is enough for Japan, and we can kind of turn our OpenAI loose on Japan and sort of compete. But I wonder if you start putting this out to businesses, you start putting this out into Panasonic, Nippon Steel, transportation systems, factories, and then sort of out in sort of the wild, it becomes glaringly obvious that it's not trained on Japanese data sets, Japanese information. And that's sort of where the hallucinations, or not even hallucinations, OpenAI is saying, hey, this is how I've been taught to deal with this
Yeah.
issue. And in this cultural context and in this linguistic environment, it just falls short glaringly and causes companies to pull back from maybe US or Chinese branded AIs. And something I'll to point out is when I actually, right now I was asking OpenAI to compare Stockmark to DeepSeek and kind of give me the thought on kind of Japanese versus Chinese companies. And OpenAI was convinced that DeepSeek was a Japanese company, and I'll share that. And I kind of pushed it like, no, DeepSeek's not a Japanese company; it's a Chinese company. And said there's no available information saying DeepSeek is a Chinese company, which I thought was a pretty bizarre hallucination. But again, maybe shows the English-speaking focus of OpenAI, whereas OpenAI maybe has public access to publications about the founding or creation or investors in OpenAI. Maybe it lacks that information or has less access to it for non-English speaking publications and non-US companies.
And one like little detail to flavor this conversation: Japan is still the third largest economy in the world, and Tokyo is the largest city economy in the world. And so like the sheer amount of GDP output, even though 0.1% of the OAI model was dedicated to Japanese, like there's still an enormous force as far as production capability. And I think Germany's right up next after them.
I think it's really interesting that I think as we're making this podcast, you and I are kind of nerding out on Stockmark, and me, but especially you, are super involved in the space. So it's interesting that it's kind of flown under the radar, right? Like we've heard really almost nothing about it. There isn't really much interest in Western press on it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting